Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is very much an honour to be the seconder on the Finance Minister's motion to pass the 2016-2017 Saskatchewan budget. I'd like to thank my esteemed colleague for his gravitas in leading this budget and for the excellent support of the Deputy Finance Minister Claire Eisman, along with Denise Maxa and Arun Scrivenis for their thorough presentation and patient responses to our questions. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, it's difficult to see the forest through the trees. I believe that was the case yesterday when the opposition finance critic presented comments for the 2016-2017 budget. In her comments, three primary critiques were mounted. Those were that we were cutting health and education, that we were no longer interested in diversifying the economy, and that we were cutting ABE, advanced education training, and apprenticeships. Another outside commentator noted that the budget lacks compassion and attacks the most vulnerable. I like budgets, Mr. Speaker. I like budgets because I'm an action-oriented person, and whereas election campaigns and even to some extent speeches from the thrones are about promises and dreams, budgets are where the rubber meets the road. In our case, both figuratively and actually. I've been really struck by the focus on a tree rather than the forest as I've watched these debates over the last several years, and so I decided to spend some time reviewing all of our budgets from the election of 2007 onwards. Our budgets tell our story, Mr. Speaker, and though individually planted, they've collectively created a pretty remarkable forest. A few key themes have run through our story of budgets, but the most remarkable one is that in each case we've had a very clear plan and that we have consistently, methodically, and steadfastly moved forward. In our first budget, delivered as a newly elected government, the then Finance Minister Rod Gantifor focused on readying our province for growth. That year it was reported that Saskatchewan was the #1 jurisdiction for exports, and we experienced an economic surge and an accompanying population growth that was placing significant strain on our infrastructure. Minister Gantifor talked about the need to upgrade and renew schools to ensure that educators had proper facilities to teach our future leaders, and that our hospitals and health facilities needed investments, and that our roads and highways were crumbling under the weight of traffic with heavy loads. It was recognized that if we wanted to be ready for the projected growth, we needed to address the infrastructure deficit we inherited when we took office. And I think it is worthwhile to point out, Mr. Speaker, that as we go through the list of the really extraordinary number, of new and renovated capital projects this government has taken on since coming to power, what is startling is not just the sheer number of capital projects that we have engaged with in record investment numbers in many of the 10 years we've been in power, but also just how neglected this critical infrastructure was by previous governments. I often wonder how many more Aboriginal people would still be in school, or how many victim and perpetrator support services for domestic violence there would be if our infrastructure had been kept in better shape. The thing about capital investments, Mr. Speaker, is that they are legacy projects. When they are left in disrepair or are grossly inadequate to meet the needs of citizens, that is a legacy and a culture. Conversely, when they are a priority and they are invested in, that is also a legacy. Both last beyond any government in power. The Ready for Growth initiative back in 2008 began year-over-year investments in critical infrastructure. This infrastructure has been focused on 5 key areas: educational infrastructure, housing infrastructure, highways infrastructure, health infrastructure, and innovation infrastructure. All of that, Mr. Speaker, serves people. Returning to the theme of it being difficult to see the forest through the trees, let's take a look at the story that our budget tells. In 2008-2009, the Honourable Ron Gantifor talked about being ready for growth. And in her comments, the member from Saskatoon-Nutana argued that in real numbers, we are cutting health and education. She further argued that a minimum of 6% is needed up to keep the costs of living. Let's look at what we've done in health and education. The Ready for Growth initiative included nearly $200 million for key repairs and upgrades to our hospitals and health facilities, as well as the purchase of new medical and safety equipment, It also fixed leaking roofs left over from the previous government's infrastructure deficit in health centres in Leader and Climax. Over $160 million was focused on upgrades to schools in rural and urban communities, including giving the green light to 11 new school projects. $400 million was devoted to fixing the condition of highways and roads, including, of note, investments to Northern First Nation access roads in order, and I quote, to lessen the isolation they feel and ensure they are fully able to participate in our growing economy. As part of keeping promises from the election that fall, the budget also included investments to provide cancer patients to have access to drugs to help prolong their lives. We committed and delivered on doubling the caregiver tax credit for family caregivers who look after elderly, sick or disabled family members. In that year, the government promised and delivered on its promise to devote $1 million to support transition houses and sexual assault centres. We addressed the nursing shortage in the province, added training seats, increased support for cancer patients, and conducted the Patients First Review and Patient Exit Surveys. That was only in one budget year. In terms of investments in social infrastructure in 2009 and 2010, Rod Gantafor also began to look at how we serve and include people with disabilities in our growing economy and community. We began to look at wait lists in the community living division by expanding facilities and creating more spaces for people with disabilities. We invested in transit support for people who had disabilities. We also created, of note, 1,000 new childcare spaces and over $12 million in added funding towards space expansion and increased pay for early learning and childcare workers. That year, we committed to the Children's Hospital in Saskatoon and a mental health plan. The following year, capital projects were engaged to improve, repair and replace facilities and increase the number of medical professionals were key focuses. The Cancer Agency was well funded again to support patients, and we invested in reducing surgical wait times. 12 new postgraduate seats in the College of Medicine were added, which doubled the number of new seats since elected. These obviously were and are critical frontline medical professionals in our healthcare system. We also began to provide support for autism, another enduring theme. In K-12, funding announcements were made for 6 new schools and upgrades to 7 existing schools and an increase of $33 million in operating funds for school divisions. We also invested in housing, as many people in those days were struggling to make ends meet in a market where housing reached a shortage. So we started Head Start on a Home, which allowed more people to own their own home by providing a low-cost fixed mortgage, which provided home ownership opportunities to about 1,000 families that year. Social services received an increase to help for spaces for the intellectually disabled, an enduring theme throughout our government. And of course, continued investments in infrastructure like the children's hospitals, the twinning of Highway 11, and so on continued. We also continue to increase our share of the cost of education, bringing it to 65% from only 40% prior to 2007. Pre-K to 12 got a 9.1 increase in funding and the approval of 120 school renovation projects in 65 Saskatchewan communities. $2.6 million to develop an additional 40 pre-K programs and another 500 childcare spaces. We set a goal to hire 800 new nurses and achieved that. The RHAs received increases to revitalize the kidney transplant program. The Saskatchewan Cancer Agency kept getting money to increase access to chemo, mammography and bone transplants, and additional funding for increased access to MRIs and CT scans, the reduction of surgical wait times, more spaces in the medical and teaching units at the U of S, general hospitals, and of importance, the introduction of STARS. More supports for people with autism, and in addition to the Head Start on a Home, we partnered with the municipalities on 2 programs. The first was a property tax abatement on designated new home construction, and the second was incentives to develop new rental housing, and we also increased our support for Habitat for Humanity to build another 30 homes, as well as investments at the U of S campus for student housing, as well as group homes for people with intellectual disabilities and the elimination of wait lists for that service. The next year, affordable housing continued. We added the rental home construction incentive, and a corporate income tax rebate was introduced to qualifying companies to build new rental accommodation. First-time home buyers credit was added. All of this resulted in the doubling of housing starts in 4 years. PST exemption was extended to children's clothing under the age of 17. Medical professionals were added. They were forgiven part of their tuition expenses at universities, and so were nurses, by the way. In the first 4 years of government, benefits to low-income seniors doubled under the Seniors' Income Plan. In this budget, the benefit was pledged to be increased by triple, and the Seniors' Personal Care Home benefit was also introduced. We expanded the SED program, which enabled the tripling of the number of people eligible. There were another 15 pre-K programs and another 500 childcare spaces. Investments in programs targeted fetal alcohol syndrome and autism programming. Another 6 new school projects, and overall funding for school operating costs rose by 5%. And more investments in health, surgical wait times, cancer agency, and so on. The beginning of key investments in long-term facilities began. That year, 6 facilities were completed and 7 additional ones were started. The replacement of the North Battleford Hospital was added, and also the new hospital in Moose Jaw. The next year, tripled the Seniors' Income Plan, increased support again for SED, increased operational funding for all women's shelters in Saskatchewan, including facilities in Regina and Prince Albert, which were expanded with those resources, and started work on the shelter in Melfort. Healthcare partnerships to coordinate the purchase of 6 new generic drugs, the reduction of wait time, a home care services pilot program for seniors in Regina. The Sask Cancer Agency was again well funded. We also had the Rural Doctor Locust program, increasing the available pool of rural doctors, the Moose Jaw Hospital, and a 7-fold increase in Alzheimer's First Link services. Pre-K operating funding was up by 2.3%, which included a boost of $17 million to address enrollment increases. Another 15 pre-K programs. Continued investments to expand the number of seats for RNs and physicians, frontline workers. Investments in FAS and autism, and in affordable housing, the U of R residents, 1,300 new rental under the rental and construction agreement, 240 new units under the affordable homeownership program, support for 70 secondary suites, 40 homes for Habitat for Humanity, and investments in the Saskatchewan Repair Program to keep existing affordable housing units viable. The next year, again, continued investment in education capital, including the replacement of Connaught and Sacred Heart in Regina. Renovation of Saskatoon's care home, the new provincial laboratory, more funding for medical imaging equipment, the Swift Current long-term care facility, extension of the affordable housing agreement, additional supports for Habitat for Humanity with another 12 homeowners. Every time. Record funding of health of nearly $5 billion. Reducing surgical wait times again, cancer treatment, screening, diagnostic imaging services, more investment in the rural physician recruitment program, a hotspotting program to identify and provide more appropriate services to frequent users and intensive users of the health system. Care for seniors, additional monies for the Home Care First Quick Response program, increasing the Seniors' Income Benefit Plan, Seniors' Care Urgent Action Fund to address issues in the long-term care facilities, and a house call program. People with disabilities, again, 55% increase in the SED program. Mental Health and Addictions Plan, 2.4% increase in K-12 operating funding, with another $19 million top-up to address projected enrollment increases, investments in bullying and cyberbullying action plans, and community net bandwidth and upgrades to schools. 15, again, new pre-K programs, bringing the provincial total to 316. Another 500 new childcare spaces, bringing the total to 14,200, or a 55% increase since 2007. This brings us to today, where we have 3/4 of all of our expenses are in health, education, and social services. We have the largest allocation for school construction and renovation in the province's history, 9 new joint-use schools, and the elimination of school division portions of their local share for major capital projects, meaning that the province took over 100% of the capital costs of school projects. On our second critique, the finance critic said, "We're no longer interested in diversifying the economy." Okay. Again, looking through all of these budgets, the story is a bit different. In 2008-09, we were reported as being the #1 jurisdiction in Canada for growth and exports. We began investments in agriculture, which have continued on to today, which was curious since the finance critic raised agriculture today. Year over year, it's been somewhere where we've invested. The government had campaigned on fully funding agricultural risk programs like crop insurance, agri-stability and agri-invest programs, and we delivered every single year. Actually, not only did they deliver, but the crop insurance program was not only fully funded, but was increased that year by $25 million. Municipalities got part of a revenue sharing agreement that got the first of a series of increases. In 2008-09, revenue sharing was increased to 7%. Of importance as far back as 2008-09, because yes, we've been in power for 10 years. We recognized and committed to initiatives designed to try to facilitate the full participation in the economy by First Nations and Métis people. The approach then, as it was now, is to work with First Nations and Métis entrepreneurs, particularly to boost northern employment and business development. In 2009-10, the housing collapse happened in the United States, contributing to a global recession. In some ways, the conditions of that time are similar to the ones today, and we did not stand idly by. In fact, we adopted many of the same approaches we have today, keeping taxes low and continuing to invest in infrastructure. In fact, in the 9-10 budget, we made the largest education property tax cut in Saskatchewan history and increased our own educational funding to 2/3 of the cost. We also began to chip away at the infrastructure deficit we inherited, and we gave an economic booster shot in the fall to invest in schools, long-term care facilities, better municipal infrastructure, better and safer highways, increases in housing and jobs, and in this budget invested another $1 billion on top of that in all of those areas. This all totaled an investment of $2.5 billion in capital funding in just 2 years. This also included moves to begin a new revenue sharing deal with the municipalities. We also did something, we also added the Saskatchewan Research and Development Tax Credit, making it fully refundable to provide financial support incentives to leaders in innovation in our province. And of course, we continue to invest in agri-stability, agri-invest, crop insurance, and PTRC. In the 10-11 budget, we started off by talking about the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Batoche, the anniversary of the Riders, and so on. But some of the headlines that year were like this: Saskatchewan job numbers surge, Saskatchewan economy expected to lead, a description by the RBC that our province was off to a rip-roaring start. The CIBC noted that we would lead the country's economic growth that year, an economic growth that was then predicted to be the 3rd best in the country at 3%, and then we were the only province noted to have posted significant job growth the previous year. Small business owners were among the most optimistic in the country. Our provincial unemployment rate dropped to 4.3%, by far the lowest in Canada, and our population continued to grow. That budget was all about innovation and agenda and building the knowledge economy by focusing on Saskatchewan export and trade markets, agricultural biotech, value-added development in nuclear and carbon capture. We put resources into the synchrotron on the U of S campus, the PTRC, and telecommunications research. The Premier made several trips that year to the United States, where he personally made the case on Capitol Hill The energy made the case to China, missions went to Asia and India, and as a result of these efforts, canola sales to China went up by 80%. Peas were up by $105 million, linseed was up by 341%, and we sold $970 million worth of goods to India, setting up Saskatchewan to contribute 45% of all trade to that country from Canada. Much of this was attributed to our increased support of STEP, our focus on agricultural exports and crop diversity, and similar investments in agricultural research and development. We also reduced red tape and regulations for businesses and began to reduce our own spending by finding efficiencies and measuring our performance. We were still the lowest tax jurisdiction in Canada. In 2011-2012, we noted that the population of our province continued to rise and that Saskatoon and Regina were the fastest and third fastest growing cities in the country. Housing starts were up, wages were up, and we had the lowest unemployment in the country. In that, we noted that our very first act after getting re-elected in 2007 was to eliminate the PST on used cars. That same year, the basic spousal and personal exemption for dependent children was raised, which took 92,000 people off the tax rolls. In 2009, the education property tax was cut. In 2011-2012, the basic spousal and tax exemption was raised by another $1,000, and the children exemption raised by another $500, resulting in a total of 114,000 people coming off the provincial tax rolls, giving us the highest income threshold in Canada. We also again recorded high on business optimism. We cut small business income tax rates by more than half, which gave us one of the lowest business tax rates in the country. We reduced approval and licensing times. The potash industry invested nearly double their capital expenditure in this province, creating thousands of new jobs. And these were facilitated by a stable tax and royalty structure. Again, we fully funded the farm income stabilization programs, highway increases, police services increase, and again the fulfillment of a new funding model based on a full percentage of the PST for our municipalities. And on innovation, Canadian Light Source, investments in ag biotech, Sask Research Council, PTRC, and a knowledge-based economy. Moving from there, we had our crop production was up by 15%. The economy continued to grow. International exports grew by 25%. Oil and potash production and sales were up. Building permits grew by 25%. The economy grew by 3.5%. We had the lowest unemployment in the country. Our debt to GDP ratio was the second lowest, and we were among Canada's leaders in economic growth. We also continued to invest in infrastructure in schools, healthcare facilities, highway and infrastructure. 6,000 kilometers of highways were improved over this time. We did research and technology grants in agriculture, investments in SRC, who did things like helping Canadian vaccine companies export their products to Brazil. We focused on value-added opportunities for natural resources, water security research strategy, boreal water strategy for the Northern Lakes. The Institute for Food Security was established, and we invested once again in a Canadian Light Source. The unemployment rate was only 3.8%, by far the lowest in Canada, and we increased funding to the Saskatchewan Arts Board and to Creative Saskatchewan's investment programs, again keeping building highways and hospitals as well as the Southeast Bypass. The opposition critic also talked about cuts to ABE, advanced ed training and apprenticeship. Again, in 2008, we froze tuition to advance ed and had an 8% increase in university operating costs. We also supported the Johnson Shroyama Graduate School. We addressed labour shortages by increasing training opportunities, including 300 more on-reserve ABE seats for Aboriginal people to be delivered through local colleges and the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology. Again, we increased operating funding for K-12. We also started the Graduate Retention Program, the most aggressive youth retention program in Canada that year. We invested in the Aboriginal Workforce Development Fund, as well as new regional colleges to improve the accessibility to post-secondary education by people in our rural environments. We had 1,100 new apprenticeship training seats. We also increased the operating grant in the next year to our universities, which included an extra $16.3 million to keep tuition increases down. The funding for the graduate retention program increased by another 4.3%. The following year, $24.6 million to the universities to limit tuition growth, $6 million devoted to expanding physical and nursing training programs, and of importance, $48.6 million in direct support for Aboriginal education institutions, including ABE and the Provincial Training Allowance, all of which increased funding to educational opportunities for Aboriginal people by $13 million. Next year, 2% increase to support operating costs at the university. The Northern Action Plan to work with leaders to address issues that hinder social and economic progress in the North. Additional resources for First Nation people, resulting in almost 600 more Aboriginal Métis people who are employed, as well as a 24% increase in the number of First Nations and Métis apprentices and a doubling of the First Nation and Métis journey person certifications. Advanced Ed got a 9% increase, resulting in a 40% increase in funding for Advanced Ed since 2007. We eliminated the wait list for ABEs for Aboriginal people. Work readiness, we had work readiness employment development, the Northern Career Quest program, the Saskatchewan Industrial Trades and Employment Partnership, the Inroads to Agricultural Careers program, and the Aircraft Maintenance program at the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology. Additional funding was put towards the recommendations by the Joint Task Force on improving education and employment outcomes for Aboriginal people in partnership with FSIN. The result of all this, close to half of the people employed in the uranium industry at that time were Aboriginal. Again, the following year, more increases to post-secondary education, expansions of RN seats, technical institutes and regional colleges, medical undergraduate seats, medical residency, as well as nurse practitioner seats. Not only was the ABE waitlist eliminated for Aboriginal people, but 300 seats were added last year and another 700 were added in this particular year. 300 apprenticeship seats were also added. Mr. Speaker, this brings me to today. This long story brings me to today, and it's this. Today, in response to the three criticisms by the member opposite, today, STEP members forecast an increase in exports in 2016. Today, we beat our own target to export agri-foods, which was projected to be $15 billion by 2020. We're here in 2016, and we already hit $15.1 billion. Today, still, we are the most attractive jurisdiction in the world for mining, and second globally. Today, still, we have a number of achievements in manufacturing, and today, still, we have invested year over year over year in supporting our agricultural producers. The point of growth, as the Premier has said often, is to secure a better quality of life for Saskatchewan people. I don't think, having read all of this, that we can be characterized as cold and callous. Instead, I would say that a family of four with an income of $50,000 pays the lowest taxes and utilities in Canada, Mr. Speaker. Again, 3/4 of our budget is in health, education, and social services. Cold and callous people don't do that. We have the continuation of 9,000 ABE spaces and a 76% increase in apprenticeship training seat growth. 9.7 million increase over last for the SED program, and investments in targeted supports for classrooms, which includes support for our Syrian students. I end by noting that we have a deficit. It is a conscious deficit, not to hurt our most vulnerable people. And like all the plans we've had so far, we will deliver on reducing that deficit because our Finance Minister has a plan and he will deliver. I close, Mr. Speaker, by saying I will be supporting the budget presented by the Minister of Finance with no amendments. Thank you.